Well, thank you. I open the discussion. Yes, please. Phillips.
Pierre, I wonder whether we could have again the slide that showed the response of various places in the world to the various questions about climate change. Is it possible to see that slide again?
Yes.
Because I think it was quite a...
If I have the slides.
Could we see the slides?
Yeah. Okay, I had a list which was UN, UNESCO, IPCC, academies.
Yeah, okay. So, so if we could go to that slide.
The last one.
Showed, okay, back.
Back, oh, okay.
That's the one.
That's one.
Right. So now, I'm having a hard time understanding the significance of the difference, let's say, between Latin America, the U.S., and China, if the reason is to be understood as being education. Well, I guess the laughter of the audience means I don't have to elaborate on why I've asked this question. You see, are we to believe that Latin America is better educated than the U.S., or is there something else that is causing this difference in the question of whether climate change is a serious problem?
Well, you are certainly right, and this is a global measurement of many factors, and education is probably only one of them. I had another slide which I didn't take time to show, which is in the UNESCO 2016 report analyzing PISA results, which are 15 years young people. And this shows something which is corroborating this graph, namely that in the curriculum of a large fraction of the countries, sustainable development and climate change are not even present. I mean, the words are not even present. So it's difficult to expect that the adults, which are the subject of this inquiry, understand the issue if even the words do not have a meaning, not to speak of the consequences, the model of climate, and so on. So we'll see that the next PISA will be out next week, so we'll see if this has made progress. It's focused on science this time, so it will be interesting to observe it. But my point was simply that in the preparation of the curricula and the teacher training for next year, if all those ideas are absent, we cannot expect the public to react better.
Well, continuing with this slide, looking at the difference in the responses of people in China. So with almost everybody else, there is a decline in the belief of the importance of climate change as a problem when it's made more specific. That is, do you think that people are being hurt? Do you think you yourself will be hurt? There's a decline. But in the case of China, more than twice as many people believe that climate change is harming people than believe that it's a serious problem. Do you understand that?
No, I don't think I understand. And we were hoping to have a Chinese member of NGO who studies that, and but he didn't come to this meeting apparently, so I think he would have given the answer. Now, this probably requires a lot more study than what we have at present.
China quite a bit, and so let me say that first. The thing that makes people in China believe this is a serious problem is they conflate runaway air pollution, which is obviously killing hundreds of thousands of people a year with climate change. And you can't breathe that air all the time and see all the pollution around you without thinking that climate change in a very general way, including air pollution, is a terrible problem. Why the left-hand column in China was the way it was, I don't know. The more fundamental thing that I wanted to say, though, is I have it's absolutely important to let our children understand the scientific method as closely as they possibly can and to be able to follow the reasoning of science. But certainly in the United States, and I think elsewhere, there's little reason to think that people have changed their minds based on understanding the scientific evidence presented to them. And I think that's why we need good scientific education, because it's fundamentally important for our societies to work. On the other hand, as many of us have included in earlier meetings and as we're working out in various ways now, it's really basically a moral or ethical position that will bring people around to accepting things like climate change and acting on them. And in the United States, it's very obvious that both evangelical Christians and Catholics believe that climate change is a serious problem because it injures the poor. It says very clearly in the Bible that you shouldn't do harm to the poor, and both evangelical Christians and Catholics in the United States take that seriously. And if you point out that climate change injures the poor, you don't have to understand the rationale for it. You simply don't want it. But to form the kind of worldwide associations that we're going to really need to deal with these problems and make them last, we're going to have a moral and ethical switch, because time is running very, very rapidly on us, and it's not going to happen by reading people scientific data or correlations. They affect a few people, but only a small percentage of the population, I'm afraid.
So, with all respect, Pierre, but maybe the situation in the United States is some people are not convinced that we scientists have proven that the human activity increases the temperature or produces global warming. And I must say, even among your academy, you have one that is not convinced that we can measure the activity of CO2, how much the temperature goes up. Because, for me, 10,000 years ago, we had Canada covered by ice. Now it left all these lakes. These are simple. When I was a child, the only glacier that was expanding was the Mariano Moreno Glacier in Argentina. Probably to this day is the only glacier that is expanding. So there are these long-term changes, and so on which we're now trying to see small variations in temperature. So you're trying to say we should educate all the children, but I think maybe you have to educate people on whether the scientific fact is there or not. There's a lot of skeptics that's on this.
Just a quick editorial point. Actually, Anthony Lazarowitz, who measures understanding in the United States of climate change, finds a clear majority of people in all sectors of society that do accept that climate change is human-driven and is it affecting their futures. It has grown and grown over the years, and so it's so now.
President Trump, no.
No, in this discussion, I'm aware since quite a long time how difficult it is for us scientists to reach a worldwide consensus on new insights. That may take decades, even sometimes half a century. And this is a very serious problem if we have the intention to bring in new things rapidly into education worldwide.
If I can make a brief comment on this, in France today, a large fraction of the population doubts the science to the point that they refuse vaccination. This is producing deaths of young people but the evidence is just negated. And this is, again, a question of trust in science and trust in their proposition. And even if the trust is only to 90%, but it's still a matter sometimes of life or death.
Oh, that one. Sorry, got it now. Yeah, thanks a lot. I have two comments, but I'll postpone the second one, which is on the last question. But first, I want to emphasize what Pierre mentioned in terms of teaching, children, learning, and so on. The very large importance of the new pedagogical ways to teach, which is to have the children, in terms of science, doing science instead of memorizing. But the whole point is to teach the scientific method, to draw conclusions based on evidence and not just on beliefs, on arbitrary beliefs. And that can be done very efficiently. It's now, as we know, in France, even Mexico, Australia, there are now literally millions of children using this new approach, which works very much better than the conventional approach of just memorizing. So they learn how to think, how to really make conclusions based on evidence. But there's a second point. That's science, but science itself, we've been talking about this earlier today, science itself is neither good nor bad. So there's a separate issue which is ethics or the moral points. And it turns out that with these new pedagogical tools, it's also possible as a separate issue to teach the children responsibility, ethics, and so on. And we can just see empirically when the children do experiments with plants and so on and so forth, they learn to appreciate nature. But also, the idea of this new way of teaching, they learn to talk to each other, to respect other opinions and so on. So you are simultaneously teaching how to think, but also very fundamental ethical principles that we here certainly accept, that you have to respect how other people think, but you have to work with the poor for the good of humanity in very general terms. Because again, I insist, science alone doesn't tell us what's good and what's bad. And very briefly to the last point, I will expand that on Saturday, since I will have a time to speak, but just very briefly, even though I'll repeat it on Saturday, what is very clear with climate change, sorry to disagree, is that there's a very clear, overwhelming consensus among experts. There are many scientists who doubt this, but they are far from being experts in climate. Okay. So the experts, I mean, there's so much evidence, and if we have time, we could argue. Of course, climate has changed in the past. People in the past were sick also, and so we know that doesn't mean that we don't need physicians today, because people have always been sick. People have always died, so why do we worry about improving health and so on? So there are very, very clear reasons for that. And in the United States, again, as I'll point out a little bit more clearly on Saturday, there are other reasons as well, which is that the problem has become politicized and that there's a conflict with economics, which is also wrong, and so on. There are other issues, but perhaps the most important one in the United States that had a worldwide implication is that there were some very large investments for a very efficient public relations campaign with the media, precisely to question the science of climate change. And that was extremely efficient because there was a lot of money involved until recently that we scientists realized that we were not communicating properly. So in the United States, we see the numbers now changing very rapidly because climate change is now so obvious. It's clear that climate change is happening. It's clear that carbon dioxide absorbs in the infrared and so on and so forth. So the science is overwhelming. Anyhow, we could discuss this point further, but I do disagree just because there are scientists that don't believe this, that doesn't mean anything because in general they have not published anything really relevant in connection with this question.
It is now time to hand over the chairmanship to Pierre Léna. Thank you for the contributions to this session, and I look very much forward to the next session.
Thank you. So now we have a long session, which is in fact the mixing and the convergence in a single section of two different kind of topics. The first two papers that we have before lunch are directly related to the astrophysics part, which was planned initially at a different time. Then we have a dedicated session on Georges Lemaître. You know, it was the 50th anniversary of the death of the cosmologist and former president of this academy, Georges Lemaître. The bronze statue is in the corridor there. I'm sure you have noted it. And this session will take us for the first half of the afternoon. And then after the final discussion on this, which will be with the presentation of Thomas Hertog, we go back to a different aspect of physics and cosmology, both technology and fundamental science. And this will close the day. And I'm sorry I've been given the task to chair all that. I think it's unusual in this room to have such a long speaker. So if you are unhappy with my chairing, I'll be happy to leave the chair to someone else at any time. Okay, so now I call Martin Rees for the future of space exploration and technology.